Hello, everybody. Welcome to Real Therapy Gone Wrong, where film real meets real. We are two sex therapists who point out the difference between Hollywood therapy and real life therapy. This show does not constitute a therapeutic relationship. In this episode, we'll be covering The Sopranos to kind of kick off our first official episode. And Brandy, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you give our listeners a summary of the episode that we watched, and then we'll get into it.
Awesome. So we chose season 3, episode 4 of The Sopranos, and this episode is called Employee of the Month. And before we get into it, I just want to give a trigger warning that there is a sexual assault that I will briefly mention. And also, probably most of the episodes of our podcast won't be appropriate for children because of cursing. So this episode kicks off with the phone ringing, and it's Tony's mistress of the day begging him to come over. Also, she's demanding her sister's leg back, which we kind of get a little bit more of the reason for that towards the end of the podcast. He, of course, is incensed that she's called him in home and yells at her never to call again. And then in the next scene, we cut to Dr. Jennifer Melfi, who's played by Lorraine Bracco, who is just the most amazing actress. And she's doing dishes with her husband, Richard, in the kitchen. And he asks her if she's seeing his favorite patient. And they kind of rib each other back and forth. And he says, I can't believe you took him back. And she says to her husband, I took you back, because they had been separated and got back together. And then she's talking all about this client to her husband, the client being Tony Soprano. Tony Soprano. And then also in this scene, there's this angst with her husband about being an Italian American and what that means. And I feel like that theme kind of goes throughout this episode in particular as well. There's more talk about Tony, and then the next scene, actually, we see Tony and Dr. Melfi in Dr. Melfi's office. And so I looked up because I was just curious how many episodes Lorraine Bracco was in of The Sopranos and like who she was, because I needed a refresher. So she's actually not a therapist, she's a psychiatrist. So she prescribes medication to him. And she is in episode 1, and she actually was in 69 out of the 86 episodes, which I thought was really interesting.
It's a lot for her to be in.
Yeah, so she is this really integral character throughout the whole show, and some really interesting things happen with her in season 2. So if you haven't watched The Sopranos, I highly recommend all 86 episodes. So the next scene is in her office, and every time they show her office, I am like, this bitch must be so expensive, because her office is flawless.
Her office is nicer than my house. Like, I'm just like, what the hell?
Seriously, it's like a therapy dream. Although the window is really small, and I mean, we could totally get into all of the things about her office being a very tight container. And but anyway, so they're in the office. It's very fancy. She is looking flawless as usual, wearing her fancy clothes. Her hair is well coiffed. And Tony even compliments her on her outfit. Um, and so he makes some bullshit, like he's just bullshitting around and keeps changing the subject. And she asks him directly, are you happy? He just keeps making jokes. She says, let's bring your wife in. Tony just keeps changing the subject, talks about his mom, talks about his son. They're bouncing around. There's no therapy happening. And then in the next scene, you see Dr. Melfi talking to her psychiatrist, who's played by Peter Bogdanovich. And she says that she is charmed by a sociopath, which definitely, I think, in most of the episodes that she's in, it is apparent there is something about him that she finds just charming.
Yeah.
Even though she knows that he's a gangster. And
because she even, like kind of like you said earlier, she like dropped him as a client and then took him back as a client. So she's keeping him in her life somehow,
Yeah. Yeah. So she's charmed by the sociopath. She accidentally reveals his name to her psychiatrist. And he really encourages her to refer Tony on to a behavioral therapist. So that's kind of where we leave that scene. And then in the next scene, we have Janice, who's one of my favorite characters on The Sopranos. She's played by Ada Turturro. And she's using a metal detector in the basement of their dead mother's house, trying to find some lost gold or something. And Tony bangs on the door, and then he comes in and he starts demanding that Janice give his girlfriend's sister's leg back. So it turns out Janice is holding the leg hostage because she thinks that this woman has their mother's records. And she feels very sentimental about the records and will not give the leg back. And they did one thing in the scene that I really didn't like, and that is that they keep equating Ukrainians and Russians. And I think, especially with what's going on currently,
Oh,
I'm sensitive
yeah.
to that. But like this episode came out decades ago, right?
2001 it came out.
2001.
So,
Yeah.
oh my god, yeah, that was 23 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So, but they definitely were equating Ukrainians and Russians, and Tony's like, "Do not get involved with the Russians," because he doesn't want to get involved with the Russians. So then they cut to the restaurant. What is the restaurant's name that is so prolific? I could not think of it. Arnie's. Anyway,
Maybe, I can't think of it, yeah.
Drea D'Amato is playing the Adriana, and she's playing the hostess. And then Jackie and Ralph are having a conversation about how Jackie should not get involved in the mafia, basically. Then Tony goes to visit Johnny Sachs. So Johnny Sachs is like the head of the other major crime family. He's like the New York crime family. Tony Soprano is like head of the New Jersey crime family. So Johnny Sachs is moving to New Jersey and made the mistake of not telling Tony that
This scene was so funny to me.
right?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Donnie's wife opens the door and her hair is like up to Jesus. I mean, very teased, very large. They have this sort of conversation about the house, but it's also a veiled conversation about territory. And Johnny Sachs is basically like, don't worry, I'm not going to come in and invade your territory. And
I
then,
laugh I laughed so hard. Maybe you're getting to it, but I laughed so hard because you can tell he's pissed. He's
yeah.
super pissed that he did not tell him he was moving to New Jersey, and he doesn't really let it go, but he's like, "Well, are we gonna see the rest of this shithole or what?"
Yeah. And meanwhile, it's a palatial mansion in New Jersey.
Yes. Oh gosh.
So from there, Tony goes to visit Ralphie and Furio, and Tony says that he's passing Ralphie over for a promotion. And Ralphie is pretty pissed about this, and this will come up definitely in later episodes because Ralphie did not make captain. So then we go back to Dr. Melfi, and she's seeing Tony, and she's feeding Tony this I want you to move to a behaviorist model, and he gets mad because he doesn't want her to leave him, or he doesn't want her to make him go away, and she's flustered. And when she's leaving her office, so there is like this quintessential scene, we all know what's going to happen. She's on the fucking phone, she's in a stairway, she's not paying
Mhm.
attention, she's going to the car. It is like horror movie 101, right?
Yeah.
And she gets attacked. Not that I'm saying it's her fault, so don't hear that. It's never a woman's fault, but also you just know how they're creating this scene that this
That's
is
how they
gonna
set it
happen.
up is like, you
Totally.
definitely can tell, like, something is about to happen. Mhm.
Totally. You can tell something's about to happen. This guy walks past her up the stairs, and then when she gets to the car, turns out same guy. He attacks her, he drags her, and he rapes her in the stairwell. She is such a good actress. Like she played that scene so well.
She did, and she did it like, even I know you'll get to it too, of, like, future scenes or, like, she's talking to Richard, like, post,
Yeah.
sexual assault, and even in those scenes, she's amazing at kind of showing how much it really fucks you up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She really she yeah, and the makeup they did on her, like, cut to the scene at the hospital where she's getting medical attention and Richard's there, and they show her knee is banged up and her face, and just the makeup, how they filmed it. I thought they did a pretty good job. They didn't show a lot of like the rape kit situation, but I thought they did a pretty good job with the cops that were there, like
Yeah.
questioning her. And they said they actually caught the guy close by. And then at one point her son comes in, her and Richard's son, and he clearly has some rage issues of his own, like just generally it seems like, cuz he comes in, he says we're going to kill these motherfuckers, and is just very angry, but that's the only time you see him in the episode.
Yeah.
So we don't know what else happens with Jason. And then the next episode, it shows Dr. Melfi canceling her clients, and she's in front of Richard, again, her husband, and she's
Oh
calling these
my
people.
god, that was one of my notes that I was gonna go over, is she's just like, "Can I talk to Tony? Can I talk to" like, she's just giving away client names, and her husband's just willy-nilly hanging out, and I'm like, "Oh lord, the ethical violation, the
Seriously.
breaking confidentiality." Uh,
Seriously, we'll
yeah.
get into it. So she calls Tony at home. Carmela answers the phone. That's Tony's wife. And Tony isn't available to come to the phone. So she just talks to Carmela. I'm Tony's therapist. And, I had a car accident. So we can't have session this week. And it was very cringeworthy. And then Tony comes in and he's pissed that someone ate the cake. And then Carmela says,
And then what's so odd about that scene is he's like, "Who the fuck ate my cake?" And then the next thing we know, he's eating a stick of celery.
right.
And I'm like, "Who goes to the fridge for some cake and comes out eating celery?" That was so I just thought that was hilarious.
And then Carmela tells him that Dr. Melfi was hurt and she hurt her knee and he's very worried. And then he's very fixated on knee problems. Oh, she doesn't need stitches. You can get arthritis if you hurt your knee.
He's like, "Those stitches don't heal well on the knee," and his wife's looking at him like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
And then he tells Carmela maybe she could come to therapy with him sometime.
Mhm.
Then we see Dr. Melfi resting at home, and her husband Richard comes in, and they kind of banter because she wants to call and check with the cops, and he's like, "I'll call." So he insists on calling. He loses his temper. They say that the rapist had to be let go because there was a chain of custody issue. He's cursing into the phone and hangs up. And then Dr. Melfi and her husband have a fight. She calls, they tell her the same thing, obviously, because that is what happens. And
Mhm.
then they have a big fight about that. Now we go to my favorite setting of The Sopranos, and that is the Bada Bing, which is the sex club that they run their business out of. And so the boys are counting their money and looking at boobs in the back, and they start to make a lot of fat jokes about Johnny Sack's wife, Jenny, which I really did not appreciate.
No, one of them said, like, "She's so fat, her blood looks like ragu," or
Yeah,
something like that, like, something just, like, horribly offensive and kinda disgusting. Like, I'm just looking at them like, "Ew."
yeah, it was like third graders telling your mama jokes. It was
It
really bad.
low-hanging fruit, I mean, really.
For sure.
Yeah.
In the middle of one of these jokes, Johnny Sachs actually walks into the back office of the Bada Bing, and he's there and shows them news on TV about a big project in Newark, which is going to make them all tons of money, and they toast to that. Back to Richard and Dr. Melfi. He says he wants to kill the rapist, and he has all of this internal rage about being an Italian American. Like, here we see this theme come up again with him, that people make assumptions about him, and
Mhm.
that if he is violent, then he's basically proving that those assumptions are true, that people are right about Italian Americans. Then we see Christopher, who's like a son to Tony. Christopher's dad died, and Tony basically promised his dad that he would take care of Christopher. So we see Christopher and Tony at Tony's house, and they go into the basement, which is where Tony holds business meetings at his house, um, because he thinks there's privacy. But unbeknownst to him, the feds have already bugged his basement. But the
Mhm.
feds didn't really get anything in this meeting. But what happens is that Tony makes Christopher promise not to take this other young man, Jackie Aprile, out on jobs and tells Christopher that he loves him, kisses Christopher on the cheek and says, "I love you and you're a good boy." So, like, this reminded me of how Tony can be so compassionate and sweet in 1 minute and then literally killing someone else in the next minute.
Yeah.
It shows his soft side and how, like, what a complex person he is, that all of this exists within him.
Mhm.
Then we see Dr. Melfi in the stairwell with a cane, and her face is still swollen. Clearly, it is not that long after this assault situation. She's going up the steps one at a time by herself, not getting any support. And then we see Tony in her waiting room. So Tony sees her and says, "Geesh, I hate to see what the other guy looks like."
Yeah.
And they go into her office. And at one point during this session, her cane drops and she jumps. and Tony kind of notices, and they sort of have this moment where it's like he can tell something is more wrong than she is letting on.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, maybe you came back to work too soon.
And he's totally right. And
Totally
it's like
right.
and it's like, "Oh my god." I mean, such a traumatic event. I wouldn't be back at work, especially in our line of work, like 2 days later. However, it was a very short time that she went back
Yeah,
to work.
agree. Too way too soon. So she just redirects him and talks about him learning to control his triggers of his panic attacks. And this is the best line in this whole episode. He says, how do you get people to do what you want? And that's where that session ended. And I just love that because people have asked me that. I have thought that. Why won't you do what I want? Like, it's such a common human
And the
question.
answer is, "You can't."
Right? It's impossible. So then we see Jackie at Tony's house talking to Carmela, and Tony's being really sweet to Jackie, and they banter. And this is another place where you see like his soft side and his hard side like right together. So he being all soft and sweet with Jackie. Then his daughter Meadow comes in. They've been in a fight because Meadow has been his friends with black people, gasp,
Mm.
and so he's being really mean to her, his daughter, and while he's also being really sweet to this other guy, Jackie, who is the same age as Meadow. Then we see Melfi ordering food at a like fast food chicken joint or something.
Mhm.
And she looks up and sees the employee of the month sign, and the picture on the employee of the month sign is this man who had raped her. So she runs out of the place, obviously, or hobbles
Oh, I
out.
can't imagine. Yeah, that's
Oh,
horrible.
horrible. Also knowing he's gone free and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
And then the next scene, Janice, Tony's sister, God love her, is playing the electric guitar in the kitchen. And these two people break in. It turns out they're Russians and they are looking for the leg.
I'm laughing about the guitar because they push her. They push her and she goes right into the guitar and it's like, like just the ruffled like guitar sound.
It's
Oh
just
my gosh. She is a great character. I'm with you. She's one of my favorites.
I love her so much. So they really want this leg. They're trying to get this leg. And so it shows her, she has taken them somewhere where there are lockers and she has kept the leg in a locker and she gives it back to them. Then the next scene is her in the hospital and Tony has come to visit her and she has broken ribs and her wrist is hurting. And instead of having any shred of compassion, he is just livid that now he has to get involved with these Russians because they had a beef with Janice and they hurt
Mhm.
her. And then at some point, and I don't really understand why, Janice decides that she is saved by Jesus. And so there's this whole funny, like, she has all these funny lines about being saved. Hilarious. Then we cut to Dr. Melfi's office. And so we think at the beginning of the scene that it's real. But then it becomes apparent that she is having a dream. And in the dream, she goes into another part of her office and there's a vending machine and she's putting dried macaroni into the vending machine and
Yeah.
then nothing will come out. So she sticks her arm up into the vending machine, but then she can't get her arm out. So she has her arm stuck in the vending machine, and then she looks over, and there's like this barking Doberman. And then she looks over, and there is her rapist. And then the Doberman attacks the rapist, and the rapist is like screaming out. And so she has this dream. Then it shows her waking up in bed, and then it cuts to her telling her therapist, Richard, no, her husband's Richard, shows her telling her therapist all about this dream, and she realizes as she's telling it that it is a metaphor for that the dog represents Tony, and that she
Mhm.
knows that she could sick Tony onto her rapist if she wanted to. So she gets really mad, and I feel like this is where she kind of gets out of character a little bit too. She tells the rapist that the justice system is fucked. And meanwhile, the employee of the month cocksucker is back on the street. Like she starts cussing a lot more and is just clearly really dysregulated because of what happened.
Yeah.
She says she's not going to break the social compact, but that it's very satisfying knowing that she could have that asshole squashed like a bug. if she wanted to.
Mhm. Mhm.
So she enjoys the power of knowing that that could happen if she wanted to, because she knows Tony would probably kill someone if she asked them
Oh, definitely.
to. Totally. So then there's this big housewarming party at Jenny and Johnny Sachs. Jenny has her big hair. Everybody's there who's anybody. Like all of Tony's crew is there. All of Johnny's crew is there. And you see Tony like trying to have a good time, but also you see him noticing side conversations, and it just made me think about how exhausting it must be to always be worried about what everybody else is doing around you and who is safe and who's trying to fuck you over. And
Yeah, you can never relax. There's always
yeah,
something going on, whether you're directly involved or not, and you've always got to be on and like
totally.
ready.
Totally. Even at a party where you're supposed to be
Mhm.
having fun. So then we're at the last scene. We're back to Dr. Melfi's office. Tony says he's actually been making his list that she asked him to make of triggers, and like he looks so earnest and he seems really interested. He says he wants to try behavior therapy, and she says no. And then that end of the episode is so slow. She starts to cry. She's looking disheveled. She's not looking like her
Her normal
perfectly
self.
coiffed.
Yeah.
Yeah, like she's having a moment where she is
Yeah.
definitely fallen apart. She starts to cry, and then he gets up to comfort her, and he looks so sweet when he does this. Again, we see like this really sweet side of him, and he like doesn't know whether to put his hand on her back, and he's standing right by her, and she tells him, just go sit back down. It's just my knee. And then there is a long pause of silence where you can tell she is trying to decide, am I going to ask him to kill this motherfucker or not?
Yeah.
And I mean, I did not count how long the pause is, but it is really, really long. Didn't
Well,
you think?
and she like almost like audibly gasps. Like she covers her mouth like she's about to say something, but she's like holding herself back. And then
Yes.
Tony's looking like, I don't know what to do here. And I wouldn't know what to do. If I was a client, I'd be like, do I just sit back down in the chair? Like, what, like, what do you want me to
Right.
do? So he's really, it is very long.
Yes, very long. And then he says, you want to say something? And she says no. And then it cuts to black.
End of the scene. Yeah.
And end of the scene, end of the episode.
Yeah. That was a great summary. And I have so many notes. I mean, there was like multiple times throughout this episode where I was like, oh my gosh, like we need to talk about this. I will say, like, keeping it on the end of the episode, to me, it was very, very representative of like Dr. Melfi being this person that has vengeance in her, but is going to keep the social script. Like, the right thing to do is the hard thing to do, and so that's what I'm gonna do, which is not what, the mafia and Tony Soprano are doing. I mean, she's kind of like that character who's towing the line, but then
Yes.
you know what I mean, pulls it back. Even though she does make some mistakes as a therapist for sure.
Which
She,
we will totally talk about. Don't worry.
oh yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I was thinking about that too, because I was thinking, I mean, I would hold a social contract, but I could imagine, I hope I'm never in that situation, but if I were in that situation, I could see how it would be hard to make the right choice and put your personal things aside if you had been hurt in the way that she was hurt, like I could see how that would be an ethical dilemma a little bit, maybe.
Yes, I think so too. And honestly, as a viewer, I was wanting her to tell him.
I
Like
was
as a
too.
viewer, you're like, tell him, let him kill that motherfucker. Like you're like so mad at this guy because he's awful. And like
Totally.
you want to do it. And so Tony is such a complex character because he can be really compassionate, but I feel like he's also that type of person that he could flip on you at the drop of a dime. Like if he perceives that you've screwed him over, you're done. And he could have just been compassionate to you, 10 minutes before. I mean, we see that with them. Like I think in the one of the earlier scenes where he's in Dr. Melfi's office, I think it's when she's suggesting that he go to a behavior therapist. He's like, "You're fucking unbelievable." And
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, gosh, like who talks to their therapist like that? But you know what I mean? Like he's there because he's like, I want your help. And then she's like, here's a suggestion. Well, you're fucking unbelievable now. It's just that quick. It's such a fast
Yeah.
shift that is scary.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
I want to know, would you see a Tony Soprano? If Tony Soprano came to your office, what would you do?
I don't know if I would because I mean, I can keep the confidentiality on my end, but like, what if he told people that I don't know. I just feel like, honestly, I think I'd be too scared. To be
Yeah.
perfectly honest, I think I'd be too scared.
Yeah. Well, I think also in season 2, there's a whole thing where she has to go into hiding briefly because people know he's seeing her,
Oh,
and that's why she
gosh.
fires him as a client the
Yeah.
first time. And I think, yeah, that would be an ender for me for sure. If I feared for my own safety because of my client, that would not, how could I be a good therapist if that were
Well,
the case?
you wouldn't. You
Yeah.
couldn't be. Safety always comes first, and that's what we tell our clients too. Like if you're in any kind of unsafe situation, you gotta get out of that. Before you can be okay to do other things that you need to do. So yeah, I think I would be too scared. Um and I also want to know your opinion on her suggestion of a behaviorist, or what does she call she calls it behavior modification therapy.
Yeah.
What did you think about that as a suggestion for panic attacks? Because I'm not quite making, I mean, like, we have clients that have panic attacks, and I don't think I would be like, behavior
You need
modification is
CBT.
the way to go. Yeah, I don't think that's where
Right.
I would go, but I was curious your opinion on that.
Yeah, that is not where I would go either.
Okay.
I don't think cognitive behavior therapy is necessarily a good treatment for panic attacks. I think that was maybe like, where can we send this person?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be maybe safer for the practitioner if that's what they were doing, for sure. But I don't think that's the first thing I would recommend for someone with panic disorder. Yeah.
No. And that also, I guess maybe that's kind of now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that's the point of the episode is like for the average client, right? I wouldn't go the behavior modification route. But if I'm sitting in front of Tony Soprano and he's got these behaviors that are quite literally hurting people, and I did not want to see him anymore, I could see that being kind of an out of like, here's what I would recommend. But I just don't want you to be a client anymore. Cause she was kind of at that point where she just didn't want him to be a client anymore again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
When really, I think the Tony Sopranos of the world would be fucked if they even wanted therapy, because I don't really think you can have mental wellness if you're also killing people, you know? So,
Well, no, and also it might have been in that very first scene where he's in her office and she asks him, have you been doing the log that I told you to do? And he is being really like deflective. He's kind of putting it back on her. And she challenges him, which I thought was good. I think sometimes you need to challenge clients, but she literally tells him like you're not even trying.
yeah.
And he's not. He's wanting to the impression I get, I haven't seen all of this show, but the impression I get even from this one episode is that he's almost trying to figure out how can I be even more manipulative. Like, I mean, he literally asks, "Well, how do I want you to tell me how I get people to do what I want." If that's your reasoning for going to therapy, I don't think you're going to get very far. As opposed to looking inward but he wasn't really wanting to do that inward work. Even when he
Right.
does finally bring the log, I'm like, he'd be one of those clients where I'm kind of side eyeing, like, you putting on a show.
What did you really write in that log?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into what we think of Dr. Melfi as a therapist.
I ooh, okay. She's probably a good therapist. For our listeners, for anyone who doesn't know the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, she is a psychiatrist. So psychiatrists can do therapy, like clinical therapy like she does, but they also can prescribe medication. So they go to medical school, whereas a psychologist doesn't do the medication part. So just that, even just wanting to share that little distinction. So she's a psychiatrist. Um, she seems like she really knows what she's talking about, but there's definitely some clear ethical violations, like early on in the episode, Richard is like, "Oh, did you take your client back?" And you get this indication that Richard knows an awfully lot about this particular client,
Yeah.
which is really weird.
Yeah.
Like, it's not ethically okay to go and tell your spouse like a ton of details. Now, I'll share like with my husband, I think it's okay to share like, oh, I commonly see this with couples, or here, like I helped someone with their anxiety today. Like things like that can be fine because it's kind of the nature of your work. But he knows like specific. Richard knows like specific things without a name, but he kind of assumes it's someone like Tony Soprano at that point, right?
Yeah, totally. And they're just doing the dishes and having this kind of in-depth conversation about her client, which is horrifying. Is one thing I want people to know about counselors is that we don't do that
No.
normally. That is not what we are supposed to be doing, is
And
talking with our partners or anyone about clients.
no, no, not when like the specific details. It's like that personal information that still is breaking confidentiality. And it's so funny. Like, she's like, my client had a real breakthrough, had a real breakthrough today. Richard's like, oh, a breakthrough at someone's jaw. I was like, okay. And that's when like he's pretty much accurately guessing she's seeing someone like Tony Soprano. Like you can kind of guess it, right? So the fact that he would say that was interesting. Or I think Richard says it. He's like, you've said it yourself. Your client is alexithymic. And for anyone who doesn't know, that term just means like difficulty naming emotions, essentially. I don't know if I would have known that term back when the episode came out, but that wasn't it. But even that is like, way too much about this client.
Yeah, he knows the diagnosis. He
Yes.
knows she was seeing him and then not seeing him, that he is probably an Italian person involved in the mafia.
Mhm.
Like, that's a lot of identifying information about a client.
Yeah, way too much. So that was kind of like, that was definitely a red flag for sure. But then but like in session, she has a couple of good moments where I'm like, yeah, I think a therapist would do that. Kind of like when she's challenging him,
Yeah, and
are you really
redirecting. Yeah,
telling him like, we haven't talked about your mother, and he's pushing that away. And then when he's like, well, actually about my son, she's able to pick up on the fact of what he's doing. So
yeah.
I think that makes for a good therapist.
At some point, he alludes in there to the fact that, like, he says, "Yeah, yeah, the past," or something like that, and, it was, like, him acknowledging that she thinks that his panic attacks, like, they need to process some of the things that happened in his life, like, he had this terrible mother, in order to go forward. And I think that is totally valid. Like, I have had people, or I think therapy in general gets a bad rap because everybody thinks we want to talk about your mom and the past all the time.
Hmm.
And I mean, to some extent, that's a little bit true, is that we do need to talk about the past just because we all arrived at this point having had things happen to us, you know? So I
Yeah.
think that is an area where I feel like she did do a good job.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Well, then when she sees that part when she sees her psychiatrist, so counselors often will see, like, we call it supervision or peer consultation, where we'll talk about cases. But when we do that, unless we have permission specifically from those clients, we don't use clients' names.
Yeah.
So that's why in the scene with her psychiatrist, when she reveals Tony Soprano's name, then, like, she kind of gasps because she realizes what she's done, and that is, that's against our ethical code too, right? Because we aren't supposed to do that. Peer consultation is just about, like, I have client X and here's the information about them, as opposed to giving specific names.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing too, so she's like, Richard knows way too much about her clients. She says Tony's name to her psychiatrist. And then at one point, I can't remember like at what point in the episode this was, but I think she's talking about Richard like, "Oh yeah, Richard knows my clients' names cuz he saw them on my date book." And I'm
Oh
like,
yeah.
"Girl, like
Yeah.
lock that away. Like you don't just have the names laying out for, a spouse to read." So that was another like kind of this carelessness about protecting her clients' identities.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, probably when this episode came out, I don't know if Simple Practice existed yet, but Simple Practice is an electronic health record platform that I use. And
Mhm.
Lindsay, I think that's the one you
I
use.
That's the one I use as well, yeah.
So there's no chance anybody can ever see my client's name in a date book because I have no date book. It's all just, in that record. But it's interesting because as I was watching this episode, I was thinking about how things would have been different, 23 years ago when this episode came out and how people were keeping date books. And maybe it would have been easier for client information to be less protected than it is now.
Yeah, it probably would have been. I think like I want to say the rule is like your client records have to be behind two locked doors. That might be like an outdated rule because now everything is electronic. It's like if it's on my computer and I'm locking my office door or my home office door, no one's getting in there. That's good. But back before digital records, it would have to be behind a locked door. And I get the feeling she wasn't really doing that. I mean, imagine like having like a table at your house that anyone can walk by. You wouldn't want to have your date book there, right?
Right.
If there's client names in it. So I just thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah. Also,
Mhm.
like, he was standing there and she's calling all of her clients and saying their names out loud
I
and
couldn't believe that. And when she was talking to Tony Soprano's wife, what's her name? Camilla? Is that her
Carmela.
name? Carmela. Okay. But yeah, when she's talking to Carmela, it did make me wonder, like, well, do you have a release to talk to his spouse? Like, do you like, and they don't really show that, but in my mind, I'm thinking, I hope she checked that it's okay to even admit that I'm your husband's therapist.
Right. Yeah. So in the real world, if I wanted to call someone, which first of all, I would never do, I would just email them. But
I
if
would
I,
never call either. I hell
right,
no, especially when you've been through a traumatic event. I'm like, I don't want to fucking talk to nobody. You're getting an email from me, and that's about it.
right, right. But if I were to call and the person didn't answer the phone and wasn't there, I would just say, no, thank you. I don't want to leave a message. Like, you can't betray a confidence that way. So that
Yeah,
yeah, that was horrifying. Then she's just chatting with Carmela, and I'm like, "What the fuck is happening right now? This is not
it's
appropriate at
so
all."
odd, so odd.
Also, like, to piggyback off of that, she went back to work too early. Like, you don't wanna talk to anybody, right? Why would you
She she went back to work way too early, and I feel like that's a skill as a therapist as well, is if you go through a traumatic event, you've gotta do your own self-evaluation of, "When am I gonna be okay enough to go back to work?" I'm not saying you've gotta, like, be over the event because you don't really get over something like that, but you've got to be okay enough. And how do you evaluate like when you are? And it really was like she got attacked. There was the rape. She went to the hospital and it was like she slept a couple nights and was like, all right, I've got my cane. I'm good to go. And totally not. And even in that last scene, she is crying. I mean, she's got tears in her eyes. She's crying. And then Tony is like, are you okay? Like, he's, like, going over he literally gets up to go and hug her while she's in her chair. If that was me, I would be kinda mortified. Like, I don't want a client to have to comfort me.
right,
I
yeah.
think if I went in, it was too soon, I was, like, crying, probably what I would do I wouldn't first of all, I don't think I would let it get that far, but let's say I did. If a client was having to comfort me, I would end the session, I wouldn't charge them. I would be like, "Clearly, I'm not okay. I'm so sorry that you came in and had to see me like this, but I think we need to end it here because
Same.
I'm not in a space to make it about you, and I just wouldn't charge them. Like I would end it because that is the crazy thing is, and I think this is her own avoidance. He can tell she's not okay, and she's crying, and he goes to comfort her, and she's like, "Sit back down. Like we can do this. Just sit back down. We'll keep going." And it's like, how do you keep the session going at that point? You don't.
Well, and you can't like, I never want my client to feel like they have to take care of me, and so,
Yeah.
like, when he did have to get up, like, that's horrifying, and I never want that to be the case because it's our job to be there for our clients. That's what they're paying
Yeah.
us for. It's like they're
Yeah.
not paying us so they could come in and take care of us, right? So I think that like this part of this episode is great to reflect on because as therapists, I think sometimes we think we're okay, we may not be okay, or we think we can't take time off, or but it really is unethical for us to go back to work if we're not okay. I mean, if we're kind of a crying mess and disheveled and can't just sort of be ourselves how we normally are in session, then it is on us to take the time that we need. Yeah.
Totally. And clients are, in my experience, have always been okay with that. I feel so guilty canceling. So I get that. I get like that therapist guilt as well. Like I've been out for a couple of days. I got to get back in. But honestly, I've been through stuff, personal stuff while I've been in private practice. And anytime I've had to cancel, and sometimes I do cancel, I'm like, there's no reschedule. It's just, I'm not gonna be able to come in this week, because I've got stuff going on or stuff came up, and clients have always been okay with that. Like no one's gotten mad at me. I always had that fear that clients are going to be so upset and they end up being fine, you
Yeah,
know?
same. My clients are all like, "I hope everything's okay."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because, I mean,
Exactly.
we are people, so I think that, hopefully our clients know that about us. But yeah, she went to work when it shows her trying to hobble up the stairs, and it's also the stairs she was just raped on like 3 days before. I'm like, "Girl, go home. What are you doing?"
Oh, I know. It's like it really is like visiting the scene of the crime, and she just goes right through it. And I could never, I could not, have to find a different way to get to my car or, yeah,
Yeah,
very interesting. So she seems to know, like, the image that she portrays is someone who really has it together and is really smart and is probably a good therapist, but definitely a lot of issues.
for sure, and I think going to that last scene when he says he'll move on and she says no, I I think that is so telling in how she is way too enmeshed in a not healthy way
She's
with.
attached to him. She would almost seem it was odd because she wants him to not be a client, and then as soon as he's like, "Well, maybe I will go somewhere else." No, don't leave. The counter transference is
It's
interesting.
it's reminding me of, like, fearful avoidant attachment too, like, "Come here, go away, come here, go away." Like, she's doing that with him.
Oh yeah, it's the "I hate you, don't leave me" like kind of
Yes.
dynamic.
Totally, totally. That, like that whole last scene was really well done, but when he says, "Yeah, I'll move on," and she says, "No," like, it's super clear that she has, like, jumped the ethical shark, so to speak, and things are not going well.
No, and that's her biggest conflict is that she wants to again, she doesn't tell him about her attack because in her mind it's like that's the right thing to do. But it's kind of a facade because her relationship with him is not the right thing to do. You can't
Right.
keep it like that and then it still be a therapeutic only relationship. But it's like she's trying to convince herself, like, no, we can do this, we can do this. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, y'all can't though.
Well, and it's also I think it's her trying to hold on to that idea that she could have that guy squished like a bug, but at that
Mhm.
point, then the client is serving her as opposed to vice versa,
Yeah.
and that's one way that therapists fuck up is when we try to have some kind of two-way relationship with a client, whether that's like sexual relationship or anything where the client is serving us in some way. Like, it's just gross. And so this is where she is really just into that. Now his power is serving her.
Yeah. So she's getting some kind of benefit from it. And that's just really shaky ground that you don't want to be on. You're absolutely right. If a client is ever serving us, gross is the right word. It's like, ooh. Well,
Yeah,
how does that work? Like, how can you maintain that therapeutic relationship if they're doing something for you? That's
right.
not how it works. It's definitely, I'm here to help you with your mental health or your relationship or whatever, not the other way around.
Absolutely.
One thing that I forgot to mention is when Dr. Melfi suggests that Tony's wife join the
Mhm.
session. Again, I haven't seen all of this show, so I'm probably missing some context, but I mean, obviously him and Carmela don't have, the relationship of the year. I mean, the opening scene is, yeah, mistress of the day calling and he's like, "Do you know who could have answered?" So, they obviously have like issues in their marriage. But Dr. Melfi's like, "Hey, I think it'd be a good idea if your wife joined." Depending on the context, depending on the case, that can be a really good idea. Like in real life, like I've had
Mhm.
individual clients where if it starts getting to a point where their only issues are relationally in their marriage and their relationship, whatever, that could be a good solid suggestion of let's get them in here because they're not here. They're not getting to hear what you have to say, and we can make that space here. You know?
I agree. I felt like that was appropriate too. That's another area we could give her a gold star in that area as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, she did alright with that. Mainly, it was her lack of ethics around confidentiality that that was definitely something that stood out in, like, almost every scene with her and someone other than Tony.
Like, when she blurted out Tony's name to her psychiatrist, I'm just like, "Well, everyone kinda knows who he is." You know what I mean? It'd almost be maybe not the equivalent, but, like, if Rihanna was my client,
Yeah, like,
you know?
if you said that name, I would know, yeah.
Exactly, like, "Oh, yeah, Rihanna comes in every Tuesday." "Oh, shit." Well, whoa, that's a lot, you know?
Yeah. It also is making me think about how, like, we're not even supposed to Google our clients. That's how much the confidentiality
Mhm.
piece is, and, like, we're not supposed to know or about our clients' lives other than the information that they give us.
'Cause it also creates bias.
Right.
I just tell myself, "Nope, I don't wanna know. I'm just gonna go based on what they share with me."
Well, that's all that's really therapeutically relevant anyway, you know?
Yeah.
Even if our client like, also about the confidentiality piece, we have to report if someone threatens to kill someone, but not if they already killed someone, right?
Yeah.
So, even if someone has a record of something and comes to see us, like, unless the client wants to talk about that and that's pertinent to their therapy, it's really not my business.
Well, exactly, because you don't need to know that. That's not gonna it should not impact the work that you do with them. Yeah.
So I think in compassion, maybe we give Dr. Melfi a great grade. In confidentiality, she gets a big fat F.
100%.
And
Absolutely.
self-care, she also gets downgraded for that for sure because she
Oh
should
my
come back to work.
gosh, yeah, she should have taken not only the mental impact of that trauma, but the physical. I mean, she's walking with a cane. I'm like, I would have given she should have given herself much longer to
Yeah.
rest and kind of really process what happened to her, aside from a couple of days. So, yeah, F for self-care and confidentiality, really good otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're interested in more about Dr. Melfi, you could watch the 84 other episodes, or no, I guess she's in 68 other episodes with her in there. But yeah, if you haven't watched all of The Sopranos, like I apparently have just learned Lindsay has not,
I have not. I have
definitely
not.
give it a watch.
Okay, awesome. Well, hey, we hope y'all enjoyed this episode. And yeah, if you did enjoy this episode of Real Therapy Gone Wrong, please like, subscribe, and follow us anywhere where you listen to your podcasts. And if you'd like Real Therapy Gone Right, we are two actual therapists who help clients on a daily basis. And so contact us if you'd like more about our work or want to hire us. And you can find me, Lindsay Murray, at relationshipmatterstx.com, or you can find Brandy, Brandy Sellers, at sellerscounseling.com. And our show email is realtherapygonewrong@gmail.com. But yeah, again, thanks for tuning in. We hope you liked it, and we cannot wait for our next episode. So stay tuned to see what kind of show or movie that we're going to cover. And yeah, we'll get into it at that time. But take care and tune in for next time.
Bye.